I'm Shannon Perez-Darby with Tajmika Torak, and you're listening to the Propaganda Podcast. So today we are talking about Neil Gaiman, and I don't totally know what to call this episode. We may discover that in the course of recording it. I've been calling it Neil Gaiman Me Too in my head and in the notes. So the journey to get here is that I started listening to this podcast that was, I think, just recommended to me in my feed, or Spotify said, we think you'd like this. And I'm generally familiar with Neil Gaiman. And so I was like, sure, I'll check it out. And then I could not stop thinking about it. Do you know anything about Neil Gaiman?
All I know is what I think I know. That's how little I know about Neil Gaiman. I feel like he's married to Amanda Palmer. Is that correct?
He has been married to Amanda Palmer. There's some question about whether they are still married, but yes, he was married to Amanda Palmer and they have a child together.
Okay, so the only reason I know that is because Amanda Palmer has a book about asking for donations.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. And so as a fundraiser, that was something that I read whenever it came out. And I am afraid to say that it was really useful to me because I know that like between the two of them, there have been a lot of shenanigans that I sort of have like seen on the internet, but I don't know or like Amanda's music. You know, because we're still on a first name basis. I'm always like, yeah, Neil, I don't know Neil. I've never read any of his books, but I do know he's very prolific and it's sci-fi, right? Like he's a sci-fi writer.
Yeah. And I bet you've seen something that has come out of some of his pieces. So Neil Gaiman, he's an English author. He writes short fiction, novels, comic books, graphic novels. He's very famous for the series The Sandman and Good Omens, which were both made into Netflix series. American Gods, Coraline. So he wrote Coraline, which, did you ever see Coraline the movie?
See, now we're getting into trouble because, yes, Coraline.
I knew you had seen something of his.
Coraline is a family favorite. As a matter of fact, my youngest child's boo thing calls me Other Mother with love. And so, just to be clear.
Yeah. So he's the author of Coraline.
She's not calling me she's not calling me a demon mother that crawls out of a scary hole, just to be clear for everyone.
I am instantly and intuitively understood exactly what you meant. So Good Omens and Sandman have been made into TV adaptations in which he co-wrote and wrote the screenplays. He's sort of famous in pop culture. So the show The Big Bang Theory has him come on and play himself like they do sometimes with nerdy pop culture folks. He also portrayed himself on The Simpsons 2 different times. So he is in pop culture in that way. He's a pretty well-known, famous author and writer. And as you said, he has been married to Amanda Palmer for a long time. So Amanda Palmer is someone who I have really liked and listened to. I love the Dresden Dolls when I was a 20-something young punk adjacent queer person. I really enjoyed her music. I have listened to many a Dresden Doll album. Then, yes, she did this TED Talk called The Art of Asking that then ultimately became a book, which I thought was really beautiful as someone who really struggles in asking for what I want, who would love to just manage everything by myself. I've gotten a lot out of her Art of Asking and really talking about from this punk perspective of basically funding a tour by staying in her patrons' houses and just saying, hey, I'm in this place and I need help. And really talking about what that is to be in an interconnected relationship with folks in the world. And there's been a lot of value to that. And so she is very beloved as sort of this feminist punk performer and artist. And so that is how I have sort of known about Neil Gaiman. You know, my partner, Danny, has read lots of Neil Gaiman's work, so I have kind of heard back end about him. So they have been married. They have a child together. How I came to learn about this situation is this podcast called Master, The Allegations Against Neil Gaiman. So the podcast starts off with a story about a former nanny of Amanda and Neil's named Scarlett. And this was during pandemic times. So Neil and Amanda spent much of their time in New Zealand because the pandemic conditions there were just much different. So Amanda was very public about this. She writes a lot about it in her Patreon, on all her social media. She was really sort of actively processing that she basically found herself in New Zealand when the pandemic started, and she stayed for years with her child. So she created a life down there. For some of that time, Neil Gaiman was there with her. This woman, Scarlett, is a friend of Amanda's. They know each other some. Scarlett has done some work for Amanda, like run errands and things like that. And Amanda asks Scarlett if she'd like to babysit their child. So at the time, Neil and Amanda are living in an island just off of Auckland, New Zealand. So, I have to take a little ferry to get over there. And so Scarlett arrives in the evening and then finds herself in a strange situation. So the child was on a planned play date. So the child actually is staying over at somebody else's house when she arrives. And it is just her and Neil. The podcast has interviews with her talking directly about her own experience. And so she describes that it feels awkward and strange and a little curious about why she was asked to babysit when they knew their child was not going to be there at that time or was not around. So they sit around for a while. This is the first time that Scarlett has met Neil. In the course of this, they have what kind of sounds like this like elaborate estate on this island. And so he offers to draw her a bath in this outdoor bath they have under this big tree. And she says like, okay, sure, I guess that's like a novel experience. Why not? She really describes that she knows that in hindsight, it sounds strange to say, yes, gentleman I've just met, you can draw me a bath. But she was like, at the time I just like, it was weird. It was like a novel thing they had in this beautiful clawfoot outdoor tub. I was like, sure, why not? Thanks. So she gets in the bath. And then a little while later, Neil Gaiman shows up completely naked and then casually gets in the bath with her. Casual to him, like just like it's totally normal, like just what you do at the time.
Sorry. The amount of times that men specifically act like nudity is totally casual and normal when it serves them. There's no way that you would do that with my 80-year-old grandmother.
Yeah.
It's amazing when nudity feels comfortable and appropriate and when it absolutely does not.
Yeah, there's a lot of play between the dynamic and the safety that Amanda and who she is creates for Scarlett. And then, as we'll learn, other women that are in this situation. Amanda is kind of famously known as being like a naked feminist lady. So she has a music video where she's totally naked. She does a lot of public nudity kind of things. And so Scarlett thinks like, oh, this is a little strange, but like maybe this is just a naked house. Like it's kind of weird, but I don't know. I don't want to be like a prude about people who are just fun feminist folks who just are chill with nudity. So she sort of uses that to like brush off that it's strange. An interesting thing about how this podcast and how these dynamics are is that Neil Gaiman responds to them. So he is in conversation about them. He responds to this podcast and gives written statements about his perspective about the allegations. His perspective is that he asked her if she wanted to make out and cuddle. Her telling is quite different. She says that he just sort of started to cuddle and kiss her. And then she discusses that she is like a famous lesbian about town. She's like, I'm kind of known for being a lesbian here. That she wasn't attracted to him, that she felt uncomfortable. And in the course of that situation, he sexually assaults her. In the podcast, they describe the sexual contact in a lot of detail. I'm not going to do that here. I don't think it's necessary for our conversation to get to the complexities of the many dynamics that are happening. I do think it is worth listening to the full podcast. I think there's 6 episodes now. I think they deal with that in a respectful way. It is her describing in her own words, her own experience. So she walks away feeling confused and like something strange is happening. There are many dynamics. The things that are most compelling, I think, for our conversation is that it becomes a very complex situation. So she then goes on to have an ongoing long-term sexual relationship with him after this assault. It becomes a BDSM dynamic. So it becomes very clear in the course of this podcast, in the course of a couple of different descriptions, that he is very into BDSM. He wants the women he sleeps with to call him master. And there are many power differentials. So almost all of the women are significantly younger than him. At this time, he is 61 and Scarlett is 22 in his home, working as a nanny. Also, it sounds like maybe they never pay her for her nannying. She is not paid in an appropriate and timely way for the work she is doing in the home. And then they go on to have a relationship. By her own assertion, they then go on to have a long-term sexual relationship.
I really think this goes back to what you were saying in one of our last episodes about how there's an assumption that people who experience domestic violence can't be in love with a person who harms them, or like there can't be love within that relationship. That is what's coming up for me. When I think about how difficult it is to explain a complicated situation that has varying dynamics, one of which being that we're a naked family potentially, and then the next being that something happened that was violent that maybe you don't understand yourself yet. So to try to even describe what happened before, what the actual violence is, and then to add the additional layer of having a long-term relationship with folks that you value and the fear of losing that, all the fears that come with a disclosure feels very intense. It also reminds me how we often don't talk about power dynamics within relationships explicitly. And that feels really important.
The whole time I'm listening to the stories they're telling in this podcast, I just kept thinking about the disservice that we're doing to ourselves and to each other in our inability to not talk about sexual violence in more complex ways. That these narratives of it was 100% consensual or it was rape, I see what that is doing. I see that that is serving us, that there's a function to counterbalancing just like a general environment of coercion that we all live in around that, like so much of what is seen as sort of normal sex tends to be highly coercive, especially in like a heterosexual context. We're just told men should just pursue women, even when they've put up a couple of roadblocks. It's romantic. It's hot if you just keep pushing through that. I understand how it is serving us to say that consent is very clear or it's rape. And I rarely see that map exactly onto people's experiences. And so the gap between how we are talking about consent and how most people I know are experiencing it is just different. I think we need to have space to talk about it in more complex ways and to talk about that almost every person I know has had a sexual experience that feels not right to them, that they would never want to describe as sexual violence, sexual assault, whether that is true or not, like whether that is an appropriate description for that or not. But to do meaning making of, I gave all the cues of saying yes. Later, I felt weird about it or not right about it. Or at the time, I just didn't know how I felt. I was unsure and I was unclear. And then it felt like weird to stop, or I just felt like easier to push through. I don't think we have a lot of tools and support to help people to make sense of those experiences and to help people navigate them and to help people be in conversation with each other, particularly like a person who is not intending to cause you harm. I mean, it sounds like Neil Gaiman's got a lot of wacky stuff going on. So I'm not saying that he was not intending to cause harm, but that how do we talk to each other? Like, how do we actually build in that level of complexity? And what are the practices that we have in place? And I just have not seen a lot of public conversation about that. I think for a lot of reasons, including it makes people feel very freaked out to talk about sex and sexual violence with any nuance, because then folks get afraid they're going to be called a rape apologist. You're like, no, sexual violence crushes people's lives. Absolutely. And people's sexual practices live in complexity, and trying to make them simple is not in service of helping people be in loving relationships, in good relationship with themselves, in having power over their bodily autonomy.
We've been having this conversation a lot in my home. Really, the root of it is autonomy and thinking about what it means to live in a society that really wants a one-size-fits-all response for everything. And the way that that's showed up here is we were talking about unschooling. We were talking about it because there was a big rally at the Capitol yesterday for homeschoolers. And I was not a part of it. I didn't know anything about it, but I got called by a reporter to ask me about unschooling and, how we found our way there and why it feels important. Because what's happening is there was a large scale case of child abuse within one family that had several foster children, adopted children, like I think up to 22 children collectively they were responsible for. I haven't read everything about the ins and outs of it, but I had a personal relationship with this family at the time, like a long, long time ago. And so when this case came up, it got my attention right away because I remember these folks. And what our Attorney General's response is like, we have to put restrictions on homeschooling families in order to protect children. My concern about that is that a lot of families that are leaving the school system right now are not the typical white evangelical Christian quiverful families. It's families who are experiencing violence in one way or another because of their child's historically marginalized identity in the world. Queer kids, trans kids, Black kids that don't want to be vulnerable to the school to prison pipeline, or just that the school can't meet their needs because we don't distribute funds equitably between schools. When you try to meet everyone's needs, you still end up not meeting everyone's needs. And so the idea of placing restrictions on families trying to practice autonomy is going to be really difficult because it looks different in everybody's household and like how we're doing this thing. Our way of talking about consent feels like that to me, where we're like, consent has to be exactly this exact way because this is how we can clearly communicate it on paper. But the way that we're able to talk about it more expansively, where we're like, actually, the way that I practice consent and what feels safe for me is totally different from like what we're talking about for the general community. So like my friends will say things like, I enjoy the idea of a little bit of a back and forth and like chase and flirting and stuff like that. And like, I don't actually know how to initiate relationship without some of those things. Like I have a crush. It's not fully clear what's happening all the time. Or maybe someone has a crush on me that I don't like, but we're in a exchange that doesn't necessarily feel unsafe until this. And that thing that makes me feel unsafe maybe wouldn't make you feel unsafe or uncomfortable. And it certainly might not make that other person feel unsafe or uncomfortable because they're coming from their own context. And so I agree. I think it's not just consent. It's like we generally have been cultured into a society that tells us the solution has to be the solution for everyone. We cannot extend beyond that, and we can't let it be less than that.
And the skills that I want people to have, the skill of, is it okay if I hug you? Can I kiss you? Would it be hot if I touched you here? Those are really important skills in your sexual toolkit to just be able to like talk specifically and directly about sex, to be able to ask questions in a way that you can receive a no. All of those things are important skills. And it's not the only skill. The thing that we are missing is helping people understand a power analysis. Every time I have sex with my partner, I don't say, is it okay if I kiss you? We're 17 years into this thing. That would be awkward to do because one of the things we do is we have practices together. We have practices where we have global check-ins about how things are working. I understand the power dynamic between us. If we are doing something new, we are way more communicative about it. We have, in the context of our relationship and power, understand the vibe, right? And it's like, how do you teach someone vibes, right? And some of that is about understanding power analysis. If someone's been drinking, that is a very different analysis than I do of the things are chill. There's no tension. We're having sex in a way we often have sex. That is good information versus like, I'm doing a new thing with a new person with very differential power dynamics. Like those are important pieces of information to help inform how we are with each other. And the thing that's really missing in the situation with Neil Gaiman, and I have a clip that we can listen to in a moment, he's sort of famously known as like a feminist dude. You know, he says he's into BDSM. He has BDSM relationships with folks. He doesn't deny that that's a part of the interactions and that he is publicly in support of people who've experienced sexual violence, of women, of different organizations during very particular Me Too times. He was putting a lot of stuff and supporting folks who were bringing Me Too allegations. And so his framework is like, he was in a consensual relationship with folks and it's complex is what he's bringing. But what he is missing is that, so we talked about Scarlett, but there's another person, she just wants to go by her initial K, who was a fan who first met him when he was in his 40s and she was 18 years old, still in high school. They did not have a sexual relationship until like a year later. She was 19 and not in high school anymore.
And this is specifically where the criminal legal system is, again, super useless when we think about grooming.
Yeah, exactly.
There is so much that is legal about crossing an age line.
Yep.
That is still not appropriate that is still coercive, that is still grooming, that is still violence, but it is legal. And that is very frustrating.
Yeah. So she's a fan, and I am 41 years old. I want to ask you, but I know the answer. I'm like, have you met an 18-year-old recently? I know you have teenagers in your house.
Quite honestly, though, I know what you're getting at.
Yeah.
It does become very clear. I think we've had this conversation before where I'm like, it would be lovely if we had more interaction between elders and children and like people and children, because I think there is a gap, like something is happening. You meet an 18-year-old and it is very clear that they are an 18-year-old.
Exactly. It is very clear to me that the most mature 18-year-old is not my peer. It's someone I can be in a respectful relationship with, I can organize with, but like we are not relational, sexual, experiential peers. And the kinds of relationships I want to have are with other people who can match and meet me. The most skillful, mature 18-year-old, there is no world in which I can imagine that the power dynamic is going to be right. Because 18-year-olds are very young to a 40-something-year-old, right? Like I'm in my 40s, an 18-year-old is young.
And I think there's this mythology that like even, speaking of things that we have a hard time talking about, me as an 18-year-old being someone who was called an old soul, being the firstborn, being talked about as being more mature than my peers, and how those kinds of assignments from the adults around me also gave me the idea that I was more mature and ready for things that I was not ready for. Now, I never was in a relationship with someone who is 20 years my senior or anything like that, but I did dabble. I did flirt, or I did go over to the military base and hang out with GIs when I was still in high school. So there definitely was this sense that I could handle myself better because I was so mature and so mature for my age. However, that is the responsibility of adults, though, is that no matter how mature I think I am, you should be attentive to the fact that, like you said, the power dynamic still exists. There is no reality that exists where an 18-year-old is that mature and can meet you. It's developmentally impossible.
Yeah. And that is just without the context of him being famous, of him being rich, of him being married to a very famous woman. To Kay's description, they do, over a course of kind of meeting each other a handful of times, end up in a consensual sexual relationship. Her experience of the first time they have sex is that is desired, is wanted, is consensual. She said, yes, that's sex she wanted to have. And that then over time, he introduces a BDSM dynamic that she did not want. That is honestly pretty horrific. And I'm going to come back to that because I think there's important dynamics there. But one of the other things is that then she's a secret. So they're in a 2-year-long relationship. One of the dynamics for her is that he's tweeting publicly about his marriage. He's sort of famously known as being married. They're in a committed relationship and she's a secret. He disputes that, apparently. He says that he's invited her to big, important things, but like it's not known that she's his girlfriend. I want to say some things about the BDSM dynamic. So in the podcast, I think they do lots of really important things in this podcast. A critique I have is they are very reliant on a criminal legal definition and a criminal legal understanding of sexual violence. They really focus on, who reports to the police, what does the law say, what is legal, what is not legal. I think they do a skillful job of listening to folks, of trying to lay out the information. They're not folks who are like known for reporting around sexual violence. And so I think they miss some stuff. But in general, I believe they're doing a respectful task, but misinformed maybe. A lot of this happens in the UK. The folks who do the podcast are from the UK. And so one of the things we learn is that in the UK, sex that causes bodily harm is inherently unlawful, even if it's consensual, which is so interesting to me in a BDSM context. So functionally, BDSM is illegal in the UK by that definition, which is not true in the United States. You can consent to somebody sexy hitting you. It's like always confusing to figure out the complex ways, but like sexy hitting you, right? Like there's sexy hitting. And when we talk about BDSM, there is a context in which I have very strong feelings about this. The things that work about BDSM are that it is consensual, it is thought out, and it is time limited. So what works about BDSM is that there are scenes that have clear beginning and clear ending. So when you bring that time-limited dynamic that allows people to play with desires, that allow people to play with power dynamics, allow people to experience different sensations. There's lots of value in that experience. But the responsibility of it is being more crystal clear than you have to ever have been about anything before you are touching somebody's body, hitting somebody's body. You should be like 10 times more crystal clear than you would in other kinds of sex and sexual encounters, because I think that's the responsibility of playing with those lines. There should not be a ongoing dynamic. So if it's always that one person has the power over someone, come for me if you want, internet. I am very against 24/7 BDSM dynamics because I do not believe one person should have total control over another. That is abuse. What works about BDSM is that it has bookends, right? It has a beginning and an end, and then you're going off being equal humans with each other in the world before and after the interaction.
I love what you're talking about. And I also think that because we are so unskilled about just talking about the casual, light, sexual, and intimate interactions that we have with one another. For example, can I kiss you? Do you think this is hot? Are you interested in this kind of sexual experience? We have a really hard time naming even what we desire within our own intimate relationships. Thinking about how people respond to these ideas of BDSM on a basic level, just the idea of sexy hitting, right? Like, what? Sexy hitting? Mm-hmm. It's like, and also like, I don't know if y'all have spent any time on Instagram, but I literally scrolled by a video the other day that was this woman and her partner, husband, and she was standing in the mirror with like her hoodie and her key fob on. And he walked by her to get his shoes and she says, "Oh, so I guess you don't love me anymore." So he backs up and then smacks her on the butt. And she's like, "Thank you." And then they're able to start their day.
Exactly.
That's sexy hitting. Just in case anybody is wondering, it's one form of sexy hitting. That's one form. It's not the only form of sexy hitting. So if anybody is freaking out listening.
Spanking is sexy hitting.
I know that if you are a human person who uses social media, that's a really light example of sexy hitting. I have said to my kids, even though I think it's a lofty goal, that we should not be doing things that we can't talk about. So if you can't talk to your partner about the thing that you desire, then it's likely that you're not in a good space around communication and consent to be able to actually attempt to do that thing together. A part of that came from the ideas that I know are part of porn, right? The way that porn can be a production and kids will stumble upon it and have their ideas or look for it because they're curious. Their ideas about relationship and intimacy can be informed by that just as much as it's informed by the unhealthy dynamics within their parents' relationships or within their relationships in their family. And so I really wanted to get ahead of some of these ideas that like your partner is never going to be into every idea you have about sex. Just like they don't want to see the movie that you love because they're not into this kind of storytelling. It's the same idea. I understand why people freak out because if you can't even ask somebody if they want to be kissed, the idea of having any type of interaction that feels dangerous to you makes sense because of course it would. However, when you are able to literally write a list of all the things that you are willing to do or interested to do or interested to try, there's lots of internet quizzes out there that you can do with your partner and have an open communication about what it is that you want to do that doesn't feel frightening. It is inherently liberating. I can feel safe within the context, like you said, time limited, within the context of this relationship, within this time frame, doing these things. These are the things I'm not interested in or willing to try, and be very clear about that so nobody has to be surprised and everybody can feel safe in their body while doing these things. I appreciate and love BDSM for those reasons. Because we don't have those skills in a lot of other places, I think there's a lot to learn from BDSM community about how to have those conversations in a way that is not necessarily scary. And what surprised me is how much of looking at BDSM, looking at even books like Polysecure, looking at all of these different ways to be in relationship with one another and our bodies was really healing because it gave me permission to draw very clear lines and to have very explicit conversations about what things don't feel good to me, even if it's not a moral, like it's not a moral thing we're having. That feels very triggering to me. I'm not interested in doing that. That is not a moral judgment against anybody else. If you like it, I love it. But to be able to communicate about it feels like the most important thing.
And some of the dynamics of healthy BDSM are that a person who's in a submissive role is always able to stop it, is always able to have a safe word to say, hey, I thought I was going to like this. And now that we're in it, this is a hard no for me. Or this is actually a yellow, a slow it down, like a, hey, I'm at my capacity, or I just need to pause. All good, healthy BDSM practices should have safe words, should have a way to know when it is not working for you, it can stop, and the trust and ability to stop it. And that sounds very much not present in Neil Gaiman's practices. And it does sound like he has like one very particular sexual script that he is grooming people into doing. Many of the women separated over decades. So Kay is 20 years before the experience that Scarlett has. Those are decades between those two experiences. But they describe the kind of sex and the sexual violence is nearly identical, including sex and situations that are so violent that like they're passing out from the pain of it. And that is not BDSM. That is abuse. When you are causing someone else's body harm that they did not agree to, that they cannot stop, that they don't want.
Is this the time to also talk about aftercare? One of the other things that I really love about BDSM, again, is like a part of the practice. After you try something, whether it includes sexy hitting or sexy pain, whatever it is, there is a debrief. There's a moment where you, after everything is done, you are able to give each other feedback and be like, hey, I really loved when this happened. You know, it wasn't worth stopping, right? Like it wasn't like something that was too heightened for me to stop right in the middle. But I'm not sure I want to do that again. Or I didn't like it exactly like this. I think I would have preferred it this way. And when things don't feel good or when something comes up, when it is not an abusive dynamic where someone is doing these things to you and you don't have the option to stop, you can be cared for together, right? Like we can tend to those moments when like something came up, but like you said, I thought I was going to be super into this and I actually don't like it. And I actually feel really tender about it. It maybe was triggering or it hurt in a way that I wasn't expecting. We can stop and tend to that and make sure that we're okay. We can share apology, maybe because we didn't do anything intentionally, but like none of us knew. That also is the part of the gray area of consent that you're talking about. It's not even about consent necessarily, but sometimes even when you consent, things don't go well. We don't necessarily enjoy everything we can imagine we might enjoy. And that doesn't have to necessarily mean that someone did it to us intentionally or that it was something that is somebody's fault. However, in a loving relationship where there is a good consent practice, where there is intimacy and safety, I think we can tend to those things together in a different way that makes me feel hopeful about lots of ways that accidental hurt can happen and we can approach it in a loving, restorative way that isn't about assigning blame or punishment. It's just about knowing ourselves and being able to communicate more clearly about what it is that we do want to happen or what we do like or don't like and can do that together.
Yeah. Well, there's two more sections that I want to talk about. One is something that I'm actually not clear how it is related to the larger conversation about these abusive relationships, about these allegations. So Neil Gaiman grew up in Scientology. His dad was a famous English Scientologist, David Gaiman, like probably one of the most famous during the time.
That's so interesting that he's a sci-fi writer.
Isn't it?
That's so interesting. That is so fascinating. And now, you know, Octavia Butler was my sci-fi entry point, but like, that is so fascinating. You are correct. I am interested in that.
There is a BBC interview of a 7-year-old Neil Gaiman talking to BBC about Scientology, basically proselytizing Scientology. And they end up using the materials from that interview, the Scientologist, and like put it in a pamphlet and promote it to be like, see, it's not that bad. This kid loves it. The Gaiman family ends up moving into a compound that L. Ron Hubbard also lives in. That's the family compound of L. Ron Hubbard.
Wow.
So they're working in and living in the L. Ron Hubbard family compound. when he graduates from school, he ends up moving to the top levels of Scientology. So he sort of ascends the ranks.
This doesn't bode well for his understanding of power and control and abuse.
Yes.
I feel like I'm seeing some threads that do not feel very good or comforting about what Neil is doing out here in the world.
Isn't that so interesting? Two other things that I think are relevant and interesting to the conversation. Eventually, David Gaiman, Neil Gaiman's dad, becomes a suppressive person by Scientology. So suppressive people are sort of enemies of the church. The claims of Scientology about why he is a suppressive person is, quote, a history of sexual misconduct perpetrated by David Gaiman. And so it's interesting. The Masters podcast talks about this in a complex way that I think is worth talking about complexly, because I think it's easy to say like, okay, like father like son, or there's a history of sexual violence. I think the reality is because Scientology is so wacky, we just don't know, right? Like they're not reliable narrators. So one, that could absolutely be true. And two, that could also just be something they're saying because now he's an enemy of the church of Scientology. And we know they're just saying and doing all sorts of wacky things over there. It is a complex piece of information as part of the larger story.
I just think that I'm seeing a through line of belief system about power and control more than it matters what his father did. It's not that it doesn't matter whether he did it or he didn't do it. That's not what I mean. I just mean that there is a more systemic thing that's happening in relationship to how he was raised. If you are raised in a culture that values top-down obedience, unquestioned power of some people versus other people, and destroying relationships when people are not willing to fall in line, those dynamics very much match the dynamics of sexual violence and perpetration and like all of those things. And so just like when I see, for example, Timothy Ballard and the way that he is now being accused of all sorts of sexually violent behaviors, it doesn't, to me, feel like a shock that someone who is deeply invested in a theology of power and control would also have that manifest as sexual violence, among other things. If we look at Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, who is now being federally indicted
for money laundering with Turkey.
Either way, y'all, he in trouble.
He is definitely in trouble.
Yeah, he is in trouble. I don't care what it is. He is in trouble. And rightfully so. The reason why I bring him up in this moment, too, is I was looking at his history because the New York Times published an article saying that like the thing that made people end up voting for him was his like past and where he came from. I'm not from New York. I don't know if that's true. New York Times said it also doesn't necessarily mean it's true. But what flagged my attention is that he used to be a police captain. And I had just seen this show called Outlast, which is a survivalist show where they put people out there in the outside and they tell them good luck and whoever lasts the longest wins. But in this show, they can sabotage each other. It's a little bit different than some of the other shows. And the main saboteur of the second season was a white woman who was a former cop who was the most unethical, manipulative, lying person. When I say I dislike this woman, it did not help when I found out that she was a former cop. But the reason these things are connected in my brain is I was like, she's not unethical today because she's on this TV show. Eric Adams is not being indicted because when he became mayor, he decided to become someone who's going to do unethical things that violated policy, violated his stewardship, his responsibility. It's because he already was doing those things and it was less visible or people cared less about the impact of his behavior when he had less power. This feels the same to me. Neil Gaiman, growing up within theological practice of Scientology and all the dynamics that are included there, and then to be involved in a relationship with this, really wonderful feminist musician who espouses all of these ideals that he's able to also take on, which my initial reaction when you said that, I was like, y'all got to watch out for these feminist men. Like the way that can be weaponized against us has become very clear. We can look at all of these things around them, this like map of their behaviors, but ultimately this person was probably already unethical and hurtful and doing all of these things before and the conditions that he has used as tools to only further his ability to do those things. But it's gotten super messy and confusing because he's like, I'm going to pour a little feminism on it. I'm going to pour a little nakedness on it. Oh no, that's just BDSM. And it all becomes a smoke and mirrors because we're so unskilled about talking about these things. To your point, it goes on and on and on. And people don't feel a sense of clarity about how to intervene, whether they actually understand these different dynamics. But it creates a pretty powerful smokescreen in like the day-to-day relationships that were probably around him at the time.
Well, as our propaganda Scientology expert, I wanted to get your thoughts on one more part of the Scientology intersections with this.
Oh my God, I'm going to get a t-shirt that says
resident propaganda Scientologist expert.
Yeah, exactly.
Corresponding with Neil Gaiman's public becoming a famous author, he starts to distance himself from the Church of Scientology and eventually says he's no longer affiliated. The thing that's interesting to me about that, his ex-wife, his first wife, was also a Scientologist. They raised their children in the Church of Scientology. She is still a Scientologist. His sister is still a Scientologist. She still works for one of the churches in the United States. So he has many family members and also financial ties. So he's got holdings in different Scientologist affiliated businesses and properties and things that he is the financial benefactor for. And what I'm so interested in is my perception of Scientology is a little bit like you're in or you're out. You are in and you are a public figure for Scientology, or you're a suppressive person and the church comes for you. And it sounds like he's one of the first people I've heard of that seems to be somewhere in between, because he's not publicly claiming Scientology. There's interviews of him saying that he's not affiliated, but the church isn't coming for him either. And I'm curious your thoughts about that.
That gives me two feelings. Either he is still involved with the church in some kind of way where he's making some sort of investment into the church that allows them to release him, or nope, that's the only thing I can think of. They wouldn't, especially with his... Now, maybe it's because he's not coming for them.
Yeah. He doesn't talk about it in public. He doesn't say bad things about them. He just says, I'm not talking about that part of my life. I'm not affiliated with them. And that's sort of the extent of what he says.
Yeah. There are celebrities who have stepped away from Scientology in the past little while, but I don't have a memory of like those people also being targeted in the same way that like Leah Remini is, or like the people that are much more public in the documentaries. He must still either be involved or he's like so quiet about it that they're just like, we're going to let you go because you're not coming for us. That's the only two ways I can see that being a thing, because they really are, like what you were saying about his dad, like accusing him of all kinds of things. They really do a lot of intense stalking and doxing. That's my official feelings about a church I don't belong to, but I feel like that's the only way I've seen it.
Well, thank you for joining me on that. I have similar curiosity. Maybe more will be revealed about Neil Gaiman's relationship to the Church of Scientology. The last thing that I want to talk about is the complexity of how the situation is talked about and how Neil Gaiman is talking about it. To me, it feels a little bit different than how I have seen other people who have had allegations of sexual violence against them. I've seen people almost exclusively deny, refuse to have interviews, refuse to engage about it at all. And he definitely is denying that he has been sexually violent with anybody in public. He's not denying the relationships. He's not denying the BDSM. He's not denying complex dynamics. And I think that is a little bit different than I have seen this happen. So I wanted to share a clip. It's part of the Master podcast. As the podcast goes, there are more and more women starting to come forward. So it starts with two women who've shared and talked with the podcast producers, but then it started airing in spring of 2024. Once it started airing, some more folks have come forward. And so a woman comes forward who had a peer friendship with him when they were both roughly the same age, where he sexually assaults her. I guess he pushes himself on her and they have a friendship, and she ultimately sort of gets him to stop. But it is a impactful part of their relationship, and she feels very impacted by feeling like her friend pushed himself on her, didn't really listen to her. The way she describes it is they didn't have sex. So it maybe is not appropriate to describe it as like a sexual assault, but he's like, is sketchy and violent and aggressive with her. And it feels traumatizing and impactful to her. And so they were friends. They sort of stayed friendly after this interaction. And she, many years later, comes back to him and says, hey, I didn't feel good about what happened. And she records the conversation. And so we have that conversation that the two of them had. I want to play it. So it's about 4 minutes long.
Claire has been steeling herself for this.
Hello.
Hey.
How are you? Apart from probably very nervous about this call.
She is speaking with Neil Gaiman.
Doing well.
She hasn't spoken to him in close to a decade, but she had sent him a letter to his house in Woodstock, New York State, weeks earlier, as there was unfinished business between them. For her, at least.
Reading your letter, if I'd known that I took up that headspace for you, I would have. I don't know. I would have. I definitely would have been reaching out a long time ago. I've never thought of you with anything other than fondness and a little awkwardness and, definitely feeling like I got the wrong end of the stick. But I thought you were terrific, and I was heartbroken seeing that I was giving you nightmares and that. So I'm really sorry.
It's 1:30 p.m. on the 6th of July 2022, and the two of them are discussing what happened between 9 and 10 years earlier. Claire has been struggling with it ever since, and it seemed Neil Gaiman had too. In that call to Claire, he accepts that he damaged her, and he apologizes. But Neil Gaiman's account, provided to us now, 2 years after he spoke to Claire, is that he was surprised to hear that she'd been traumatized, because he thought that all their interactions were consensual, and when he realized they weren't, he stopped. But when he's talking to Claire back in July 2022, he puts a different spin on things.
Don't think anything is going to unwrite the bits that I've obviously fucked up on this. And I'm trying to make up some of the damage.
Claire tells him that she's had a long stretch of therapy, one that's put financial strain on her family, and she expresses concern about how expensive the baby she's expecting is going to be. Neil Gaiman is quick to offer a solution.
Would you like me to send you some money?
The whole, putting a price tag on.
I mean, I'm not trying to put a price tag. I'm just trying to. I'm not sure that I'm reading you. I said that very bluntly. It's like, listen, you've got a baby on the way, and I appreciate that $500 a month.
Yeah.
Over a decade is going to stack up, and a lot of that must have been my fault.
The two end the call slightly awkwardly. 5 days later, Neil Gaiman calls Claire again.
So I have a plan.
Okay.
And I wanted to run it by you and see if it's acceptable for you. And I've been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of listening to what you were saying on the last call. So what you said about paying for your therapy, I did the numbers and I went, well, that's 10 years of $500 a month, which I make comes out to about $60,000. So what I would propose is that I will give you $15,000 a year for 4 years, which is the top level of a tax-free gift. So I can gift you $15,000 each year, and you do not have to pay any tax or anything on that. That is just a gift. And then I'm going to make a hefty donation to place you sent me the link to.
That place is a rape crisis center where Claire used to work.
And that is my plan, if that is acceptable to you.
That is really generous. And I appreciate your appreciation for the...
You know, I did something so much shittier than I ever dreamed that I didn't even realize I was doing something shitty. I did something really shitty.
My initial sensation is to have my feelings hurt about this money that's being exchanged and the way it feels like the bastardization of the practice of accountability, and that it is in alignment with the way the criminal legal system will assign a number, a compensation number, whether it's crime victim compensation or the amount of justice you get or the amount of sentencing time. There's a chart somewhere that tells you what you deserve based on how bad the harm was or the crime was, I guess is probably a more accurate way when we're talking about the criminal legal system. If this were a part of a wider process where Neil Gaiman was invited into a practice of accountability by his peers that centered all of the women who have now come forward, not just one, I think I would feel differently about an outcome that included a financial commitment than a private conversation that very much sounds like, let me just give you what I think you deserve based on the numbers so that this can be addressed and I can do the things that I've seen people say I should do. There are organizations like RAIN that the bulk of their budget is made because they get the money from these suits against people who have caused harm. And that is a very formulaic way to address sexual violence. I'm not saying they shouldn't pay money. I think reparations can be made all over the place for all kinds of things. It makes me sick to my stomach, honestly, though, that it could be reduced to that. That is not signifying any sort of change of behavior. It is a way to show a line item of accountability. Like, I paid this money, and therefore, why are you still talking about this? Why are you still bringing it up? I'm paying every year to address this, but it doesn't require any form of personal transformation or reflection or an active participation. It doesn't even really seem, and this is one conversation. However, I'm not hearing in his voice a emotional understanding of what she's describing. You know, the narrator said and you said that she has been deeply impacted by this. And I don't hear that in his response. I hear
Feels bad that she feels bad. He doesn't feel bad for his behavior. He just
should pay for the outcome, but he's disconnected from the fact that his behavior is the impact, is the thing that happened. And that hurts my heart because ultimately, I do believe that we can face sexual violence and I do believe that we can practice accountability in different ways. It hurts my heart because we're going to do this first. We're going to take the criminal legal system and their calculations and we're going to place it over top of what we think is going to solve the problem. And it's like, no, this has to happen on an interpersonal level. You have to internalize what you did and acknowledge it and accept it and understand it. When he says, I thought it was consensual, we should not be in a place with this many people where you are unclear about whether things are consensual or not. How many times do you need to have a conversation about your behavior from people who are saying it wasn't consensual before you figure out that the common denominator is not the individual people you've harmed. It's actually your inability or your unwillingness to practice consent because it serves you and the way you manage power to just do what you want and then pay people afterwards and deal with it that way. That's so irresponsible and so harmful. And I understand why people are feeling a kind of way about it.
I've had zero amount of people say that they did not feel good about how consent worked in a sexual interaction. And if that were to ever happen, it's something we treat seriously. lots of listening, lots of time, lots of curiosity, and then it should never, ever happen again. And we're at 5 named people who are willing to come forward, many with their names, their personalities, their voices attached. Some of them are sort of trying to be semi-anonymous, but I suspect it's not that anonymous, right? Especially at some certain scale. Scarlett's name is Scarlett. K is K's initial. They're probably findable by the internet, and they're willing to come forward with that information. And that's just 5 people in the course of this slow. There's probably tons more if we just know about what his pattern are. And so exactly to your point that there's an episode just called NDAs, and that what he did with I can't remember now if it's Scarlett or the fan, but he's done it with several different folks where, she's really struggling. He comes to her and says, can I pay your rent? Can I help support you financially? With that money comes an NDA from his lawyer that's backdated to the day he first assaults her a year earlier. And so there's many people were asked, sort of retroactively asked to sign NDAs in course of getting their money from him. And that's sketchy. That's a sketchy practice. Don't do that.
I feel like if you harm me and you are practicing accountability, at no time should I be asked to not talk about that harm. There may be a period where I don't need to talk about it anymore, where I feel comfortable not saying it with as much regularity maybe, but at no time will it not be true that my father abused me. Even if he was still living, I would still be able to say, and should be able to say, this thing happened. It is a factual part of my life. If there's ever going to be any sort of repair and reconciliation, silence should not be a part of that contract. That is not empowerment. It's not accountability. It is not a resolution. It is done primarily for the comfort of the person who did the harm. Now, if I don't want to talk about it anymore, if I'm I don't want you to talk about it, or I don't want you to talk about it in this kind of way, which I've heard people say, which makes sense. I think people who have been harmed deserve the right, when it is possible and safe to do so, to choose how to narrate what happened to them. That's an important part of how we heal. And so anytime someone is we're going to do this, but you can't talk about it afterward, I'm no, because again, child sexual abuse and the dynamics around it and sexual violence, silence is a part of making sure that things can happen in a place where only the powerful can make decisions and choices. And the person who is hurt or harmed has limited choices. I'm no, that is not an equitable dynamic. So I agree. And we cannot solve anything under the shroud of silence. Nothing gets fixed when we don't talk about it. So I have bad news. My bees have left the hives.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
I'm okay though. My uncle told me when I started, and everything you read says years 1 through 3 are your learning years. Your bees will abscond on you, or you'll get mites. It's a learning process. Had I not been prepared to understand that this is a potential outcome, I probably would have been more devastated. I really did feel a sense of oh, my uncle's going to be so disappointed in me. He has also invested his time. There are things that I just didn't know to look for that probably contributed to the fact that my bees left. First of all, I delayed texting him because a couple weeks ago I had honey. I was looking forward to harvesting it. And what it means when your bees leave is they take their honey with them sometimes, or other bees will come and rob it. Again, signs I didn't know to look for. So as I'm texting him, instead of texting him about harvest, I'm texting him about the collapse of my hives. I pulled apart my hives. I'm learning all these different things. I'm seeing evidence of different things. I'm thinking about the way that at first I felt ashamed. And I didn't even want to talk about what was happening in my hives because I thought it was maybe giving an indication of my neglect or my unskilled, right? I'm unskilled, I'm learning. However, the only way I have access to information with my uncle being my mentor is if I'm actually honest with him. I can't solve this problem for myself, for the future of my little bee homies that I'm going to be inviting into my hives next year. I don't even know how to clean my hives to prepare them for next year. And if I'm so ashamed and I internalize all of that shame in a way that doesn't allow me to share what I'm learning or ask for help, I'm not going to be able to solve that problem. Nothing is different than that. The whole world is like that. There's so many things that we get ashamed of because fill in the blank. And then we are like, nope, sorry, we got to do it in silence. Nobody can look in my beehive and see perhaps they were not strong enough for me to open the entrance wider, that maybe I should have checked them more than what I thought I was being coached to do. But the only way I can know that is if I face it and I'm honest about what I see. This is all an experiment. Addressing sexual violence, like none of us have the answer. No one has the like, if this, then this will happen. If we do these things, sexual violence will end. However, if we're living in under this shroud of silence where we're not even willing to talk about the things that we're learning when we open it up, when we actually look at all of the like, oh, it is interesting that he comes out of the Church of Scientology. Oh, it is interesting that this was his response. And like, how do these dynamics work together to create these conditions? And where do we see intervention sites? Like what could have happened early on that could have changed the conditions or the outcome or a person's understanding of consent? Taking it all the way back to the beginning. How are we talking about our practices of nudity with our friends and what is required for everyone to feel safe? I watched this show and I don't want anybody to judge me, even though I know everyone is going to judge me about it, that Gwyneth Paltrow produced called Sex, Love, and Goop. I know. I did it willingly. I don't know what happened, but I watched it. But it was actually good. The reason why I'm bringing it up, though, is they have really beautiful agreements. On their website, it says, like, this is how we roll. And one of the things that they say is we honor others by gaining permission first. This means that we ask before we touch, we get clear yeses, and anything else is a clear no. If we break consent, we apologize and we make it right. And the thing that I like about that, it's not clear enough. I think we talked about a lot of things that we have to do to talk more about consent. But when we break consent, we make it right. Like we stop and we make it right. That can always have happened in the first exchange, in the first time that someone is harmed. There is a conversation that can happen before we are looking at years and years and years and multiple people that have caused harm. Just in acknowledging right away that we actually didn't get clear consent and we need to change our practices.
It's always good to pay attention to who's impacted, who's willing to give away everything, whose life is getting smaller. We're paying attention to dynamics of abuse. And one of the things that happens is that Scarlett in particular shares all of her unedited WhatsApp messages with the producers. And it paints a complex picture. And for me, that is really important information. And that she did sign an NDA and is still talking about it. Again, you can't actually use an NDA to cover up quote unquote illegal behavior. So it's moot if she is talking about being harmed. But for me, that is some of the most compelling information. She is not trying to tell a simple story about her experience. She is trying to bring forward, like, I was impacted in a complex situation that deeply impacted me and in which I was harmed. And she's not trying to paint herself as only one simple narrative. She's saying, here it all is, and laying it out. And for me, that is very compelling, right? Not trying to hide, not trying to say, like, there's stuff in there where she's saying things that might feel embarrassing, or she's talking about how she likes certain kinds of sex with him, and also trying to contextualize that in the harm she experienced. I appreciate her bravery in being able to be honest about her experience and the complexity of it, because I think it's such beautiful modeling that we don't have to have simple stories of survival in order to be believed, understood, and get care.
Yeah, and I think it also opens the door for people to be honest about their own complexity and like the things in their relationships that they didn't understand at the time, or that it is a growing understanding, and how that changes the way they interact with their own healing, their own story. Yeah, it's complicated. I hear from survivors all the time about the pieces that feel complicated and confusing about their relationships to the people that have harmed them, whether it's direct perpetration or it's the way that their family responded or the way that their friends responded. Maybe that is the one size fits all to take away, is that it almost never is a perfect victim with a very clear explanation of the harm. It's almost always much more complicated than that. And I also feel a sense of gratitude that there are survivors who not only are taking that risk, but they're doing it and it is deeply impacting them and the way that they're being viewed. And they hope that the people around them are holding them through that, because it is very vulnerable and it is difficult in the world that we live in to be able to say, I was hurt and harmed. And also, I loved this person deeply, or I was intimate with this person, and maintain that relationship for maybe longer than I should have. Or maybe I was hoping that for a different outcome. And here we are. It's not clear cut. Those are stories that we need. And also, I'm so exhausted for survivors who consistently have to be the light bearers in any given situation and accept the consequences. But, we end up accepting the consequences because we still haven't figured out how to invite people who have caused harm into a practice of accountability, or to even try to hold them accountable in ways that understand those complexities.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me and being able to hold the complexities and spaciousness and the heaviness of this conversation. I know this was a heavier one, and as always, it's joyful to be able to hold it all together.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for giving me a Neil Gaiman primer. I understand him more. I don't necessarily feel better about that, but at least I have more context in the pop culture world.
Scientology, right? Wow. That one really caught me off guard. I did not know that one.
And then we just had the same with the Satanic Panic, where it was like the two things came together at the end. As a side note, there may be a murder wall being made by our episodes and how they connect somewhere. I know.
To support Popaganda, please like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. It really makes a difference.